Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Ryan Basden. I am a security consultant here at Bishop Fox. Today, we're going to be talking about purple teaming, specifically purple teaming for security success with a goal of enhancing return on investment and facilitating growth. So, like I said, today we're going to be looking at purple team exercises from a few different contexts, ranging from what they actually are and how they're performed to how they can and ideally should be part of your strategy for gaining organizational buy-in. So I want to touch on my background a little bit more than usual here, primarily because this talk comes from a culmination of my experiences in various security roles over the last decade or so. So about 10 years ago, I started into the tech industry. I started on the IT help desk, eventually moved into more of a systems administration role for an organization that was about 350 to 400 people all across the globe. So we had a lot of security challenges in front of us. And I got to learn a lot about how things are actually done. I call this my blue team era because I was constantly working with people trying to figure out how to defend against various threats that were coming our way, phishing emails, attempts at compromises through SMS phishing, all kinds of things. So eventually, after that company, I moved on to start my consulting career where I was very early at the company. And because of that, the work we did was effectively whatever someone would pay us for. And that consisted generally of compliance and vCISO services. So while I was learning how to be a penetration tester in an actual real consulting company, I was also getting to work on compliance projects and do CISO advisory for all kinds of clients and all kinds of environments. Everyone from data centers running AS400 systems all the way up through companies running huge amounts of payments through serverless architecture. So I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot of unique challenges and a lot of unique solutions. So after that, I moved into penetration testing. We eventually got to a point where we had so much penetration testing work that I couldn't do compliance and vCISO anymore. So I got to build my own penetration testing practice and again, expanded my horizons into touching different environments, working with different customers and with all kinds of different challenges. And now I'm a consultant at Bishop Fox. I'm on the red team here, which means that I get to do even more of this. I get to see environments at an even deeper level than before. And like I said, this talk comes from a culmination of experiences. I'm noticing, or I have noticed over the last decade, that organizations are constantly dealing with problems. And even though they look differently on the surface, a lot of them are the same at the core. And I think that purple teaming can really get us to a point where we're not watching the same episode of the same show over and over again. So I'm going to draw on all of these different experiences throughout this talk to hopefully get to where we can start talking about the best solutions for security posture improvement, not just dealing with problems as they come along. So by the end of this, if I can have you walk away with 3 different things, I would hope that they are understanding what a purple team actually is. So what does a purple team consist of? Who is involved in a purple team? How do you actually construct one? What is it for? And then how do exercises work? So when a purple team, once we understand what a purple team is and we have one, what are they doing? What should they be producing? What is the point? What can you expect? What kinds of things can you expect to get out of a purple team exercise? What sorts of value can you extract from it? And then finally, I want to talk about going beyond security a little bit. So in the first 2 sections of this talk, we're going to be talking about a lot of practical stuff, a lot of how purple teams work, what kinds of things you should expect out of a report. But again, the point of this talk is to actually get towards talking about return on investment, incidental cost reduction, making purple team something that can actually, again, like I said, make sure that we're not going through reruns of the same unfortunate episodes over and over. So what actually is a purple team? First, to understand where purple team fits into the conversation, we need to differentiate it a little bit from some other common types of exercises. The 2 most common exercises that a lot of people are familiar with in my experience are penetration tests and red team exercises. You hear about these everywhere. To differentiate them, penetration tests, first of all, are about coverage. We're looking at covering a wide surface area when we're doing a penetration test. Pen tests also usually take place annually, sometimes more if a framework like PCI DSS is involved. They're commonly seen as check-the-box exercises. They're not always check-the-box exercises, but they have a sort of reputation wrapped around them. And the reports that come out of pen tests are a little bit more itemized. The problems that they're outlining are isolated in a lot of cases, which means they have a lot simpler solutions. Maybe there's just a vulnerability that needs a patch, and the patch is available at this location. Much easier. Red team exercises, on the other hand, are more about depth and complexity than coverage. They're usually done over a longer period of time, primarily because there are more factors involved, like trying to evade detections, or maybe the scope is just a lot bigger. Oftentimes, red team exercises root out more systemic issues as opposed to individual vulnerabilities in an A, B, C, D order. And the reports that come out of them are quite comprehensive and often multifaceted. They both suffer from a lack of a single core component, though, and that's context. And so I don't mean that they completely lack context, because they don't. I only mean that for both pen testing and red team exercises, as a consultant, I usually only have a general idea at best of the environment that I'm looking at. So I only have a general idea of how it functions, how the environment is actually used to conduct business. I don't understand fully how users interact with the environment. I'll understand where they are, perhaps, and what they're doing, but the way they see the environment is not how I see the environment. So all of this culminates into not having a coherent threat model. So I don't have a complete and comprehensive map of the environment's attack surface and all the ways that an outside threat might try and compromise it. Part of the reason for that is that it's my job to figure out what those are. But because of this, there's a gap to fill, I think, in the greater effort to improve security postures. So now that we've differentiated activity types, we've differentiated between pen testing and red team exercises a little bit, talked about the positives of both, we need to clear up some misconceptions to truly understand what purple team is. And these come from my career experience. I hear these a lot. I've heard a lot of different misconceptions, but the three that I've listed here are probably the most common. The first one is that a purple team is a dedicated team with an entirely different skill set compared to a blue team or a red team, or a purple team consists of people who are just experts at both. So this is a misconception, because purple team exercises are actually just coherent and cooperative efforts between red teams and blue teams. The good news is that we don't have to have experts who are in both. That would be a lot of pressure on everyone involved. We can get two groups who are experts in their own areas together, and they can benefit from each other. The second misconception I often hear is a pen testing team that does a pen test while the blue team just sort of watches, which is not totally off the mark, but it's missing a bit of the core goal. If the blue team is just observing, then they're not hands-on involved like they probably need to be in order to get a lot of value out of a purple team exercise. And the last misconception I hear a lot is that, much like the second one, a red team is just doing a red team engagement while the blue team watches. There are a couple of problems with this. The first one is that ideally, the blue team wouldn't actually know that the red team is doing anything, at least at first. The second problem is that the blue team, again, should not just be observing. They should be doing what blue teams do, defending, responding, trying to detect what the red team is doing. So all of these miss the mark. What we're going to have to do, at least for the sake of this talk, is establish our own definition. So the one I've come up with is that if we're going to define purple teaming, we're going to call it a joint collaborative effort between attackers and defenders, so red teams and blue teams, to accomplish two different things. The first one is to test detection capabilities, and then hopefully ultimately improve security. So using this definition, we know a couple things. The first one is that A purple team exercise or a purple team in general is not just a penetration test where the blue team is riding shotgun. And it's not just an exercise in, quote, seeing what's possible. I've added some asterisks here because the slide after this, we'll go into this a little bit. There's a little bit of a disclaimer on this one, but generally speaking, it is not an exercise in just understanding what can be done in an environment. A purple team exercise has 3 primary goals. We should be testing if things are detected. So if an attacker is actually doing something, did it cause an alert? Are there logs somewhere that are being checked regularly? Maybe if there was an alert, did anybody see it? How long did it take them to see it? This is stuff we want to know. Second, we want to test if what is detected actually alerts someone. So if the red team was able to run commands successfully or detonate malware in such a way that they're able to connect back to a command and control server, we want to know that that activity is going to get in front of the eyes of the blue team. And then lastly, if we can, we want to know if that alert can be actioned. So logging and alerting is great, but if nobody is able to do anything with it, it's not very helpful. But if the blue team can catch that alert or look at those logs during log review and see something out of the ordinary and then take containment steps, follow an incident response process, then that's worth noting. We want to know how quickly and effectively they can do that. So I said I would issue a disclaimer on the exercise and seeing what's possible. I have seen this go right in some rare circumstances. So there are a few things required for that to happen. The first one is that the overall security posture of the organization looking to benefit from purple team exercises probably needs to be a bit more mature than usual. They need to be well-staffed and well-resourced, and hopefully they have experience in actually testing out scenarios and doing something about the results already. For example, recently I was working with a team of detection engineers, and because they were so familiar with their own detection infrastructure, they were able to look at what we were doing and very quickly identify gaps in their detection and alerting and write detection rules on the fly. This is not something that all organizations are capable of, but that does not mean that they can't benefit from purple teaming. It just means that this very quick, rapid fire version isn't likely for everybody. So how do exercises actually work? When it comes to hands-on keyboard, what they're actually doing, the members of a purple team, where do we start? The good news is you can kind of start anywhere. So generally speaking, you can start a purple team exercises in any time the blue team has a TTP or even several that they're looking to test. So a TTP or a scenario can come from just about anywhere. Some common ones that I've seen are using penetration test report results. So for example, maybe there's a vulnerability, a well-known vulnerability in a Windows domain controller. And that's been patched, but we're not totally sure if the patch works. You can always retest, but maybe you want to go a little bit further than that. Maybe you want to know if you could detect the next well-known vulnerability. That's a great start for a purple team exercise. The second one is maybe based on just a scary news headline, like an oil pipeline on the East Coast, perhaps. Knowing whether or not your company is susceptible to this sort of thing is useful. And it doesn't have to come from some specialized source. It can just be something that you saw on TV that you're not sure about. Maybe there's intel from a threat report. For example, a threat report in the last couple of years I read mentioned that ransomware gangs are starting to leverage newer programming languages like Rust and Nim, and that's helping them get past some more conventional signature detection that is built into antivirus and EDR products. This is worth knowing, because if a piece of malware that was previously written in something like C is detected by your EDR product, but rewriting it in Rust or Nim is going to get it past your protections, that's worth knowing. Anything counts. So I talked about a TTP just a second ago. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, we should establish what a TTP is. TTP stands for tactic, technique, and procedure. What this comes down to is effectively anything an attacker is actually doing, anything that any action they're actually taking to accomplish a goal for any purpose at all. So purple teaming generally follows a life cycle. So this is a continuous process. I want to emphasize that early, and I'll emphasize it even more later on. But purple teaming is meant to be continuous. There is no, okay, we're good in purple teaming. There's no, all right, let's move on to something else and forget the last thing in purple teaming. There is always improvement to be made. Things can always be better. Nothing is ever perfect. The way we accomplish this, if we're talking about TTPs that we want to actually move into purple team exercises, then we typically accomplish this by having a quick discussion and tabletop exercise. So if that TTP is, for example, port scanning, then we can discuss port scanning, what it is for anyone who's not familiar, what it generally looks like, and especially why we are actually testing it in a purple team exercise. Why does port scanning matter? Why is that something that you would want to know about in your environment? Once we've done that, we'll move on to attack emulation. Emulation, simulation, there are a lot of words for this. What this actually means is the red team part of the purple team is going to run port scanning. So this is the part where the red team actually demonstrates the TTP for the blue team to move into the detection and response engineering part. So what the blue team wants to know is if they can detect a port scan happening in the environment. And if they can they do anything about it? Whether or not they can, we move into the lessons learned and adjustments phase. So if, for example, the port scan wasn't detected, or maybe it was detected and the blue team couldn't do anything about it, they couldn't isolate the host, they couldn't block the traffic, that's something that we want to know. And if we can make changes, we do so, we make adjustments, and then we move to the retesting phase, where we can actually test those adjustments and improvements against the previous emulation part. We can run port scans again, and if they work, if the detections work and we're able to do something better than last time, great. If we're not, then we can go back around and continue to improve until we reach a baseline that we're happy with. So let's walk through an actual example. So I've got the life cycle diagram over here on the right, and I've come up with a fictitious scenario here on the left. So let's imagine that, again, we're doing port scans. That's the TTP we want to test. First off, the red team runs a port scan of a network segment. Maybe they're running it from a company Linux server that's assumed to be compromised. So we're starting this purple team exercise as if this Linux server has already been compromised by an attacker, and the attacker is wanting to run port scans from this server. Once that's done, the blue team realizes that they can't detect port scans. They didn't see anything out of the ordinary. None of their existing tooling showed them that something might be happening that they don't want to be happening. So they move to analyze some network traffic. They look across the network for patterns that might indicate that there's a port scan taking place. For example, maybe there's one particular host that in a very short span of time is scanning an entire network segment for a single service on a single port. And it's not a common port. Maybe it's not port 80 or something, even though that would be a little bit suspicious. It could be even more suspicious, like 445, scanning every single host on a network for SMB. This is something that the blue team can pick up on. So let's imagine that they do. And they configure, if they have an IDS or an IPS, any kind of appliance they have, whatever they have available, they're able to configure it to block network traffic from hosts from which those patterns are emerging. So they see this Linux server and it's looking for 445 across thousands and thousands of IP address in a very short amount of time, then they can generally assume that maybe a port scan is happening from that server. And if it's not a server that's supposed to be doing port scanning, they can do something about that. So let's say they do. The red team runs a port scan again to see if they're blocked, and it works. That's great. So this last step here, once we've done all of this, we've tested the TTP, we've made improvements, we've retested those improvements. We want to make sure that the initial test results, the changes, and the results of that improvement were all recorded and documented. So we need to have this somewhere. The silver bullet here is that last point. So in what red team or pen testing exercise or report have you ever seen a section where the blue team actually gets to talk about what they've done to make improvements? Sometimes I've seen reports where there are client response sections where they're able to say, hey, we applied this patch, or we fixed this. And if they have retesting done by somebody, either the same team or a new team, that can be validated. But that can take a lot of time. And sometimes things need to get fixed faster than that. The great thing about a purple team exercise, specifically like this, is this cycle can be done in an hour to an hour and a half. And before the report ever makes it out, there are improvements built in. So let's put all this in context. So we're using port scanning as an example, right? Port scanning itself is what we call an atomic test. It's isolated. We're only looking at one thing, not in context, but we can still put it in context, and we should, because this is how we understand how attackers are actually moving throughout environments. We understand how they're thinking, and we understand how they get from point A to point X. So using a very simple attack chain here, let's imagine that a phishing email is opened. Within the phishing email, there's a piece of malware. That malware is deployed. Using that malware, using a command and control connection, the attackers are able to run port scans of a network. As a result, they identify some vulnerabilities, some low-hanging, easy to exploit vulnerabilities, and from there, they're able to deploy ransomware. This is pretty common. It's simple, but it's pretty common. By atomic testing and implementing improvements at an atomic level, you can do something like simply block one part of that chain. Now, I've added some IDs down here at the bottom of each of these points. And I'll talk about these a little bit in a minute. But where these come from are from the MITRE attack framework, which is effectively a catalog of attacker activity from threat intelligence reports that the MITRE company actually spends a lot of time tracking and updating, and it's free and everyone can access it. But every single atomic component of the framework has an ID associated with it. So I'm going to use these for reference, and we'll get a little bit more into MITRE attack framework later. But using our scenario, our hypothetical scenario, blocking port scans is great, right? We've broken the chain between the malware deployment and vulnerabilities being exploited. Now, if you're thinking ahead of me a little bit, you might be saying, well, that's not the only way that you can execute an attack. You can't just block every attack by stopping port scans. And you're totally right. Because maybe there are other ways of finding vulnerabilities. Maybe software discovery, which MITRE classifies as T1518, is another way of identifying vulnerabilities to be exploited that you can just use to get to the exact same end. This is true. However, we can also get ahead of this. This is meant to be a continuous improvement process. So by understanding steps an attacker can take and how they pertain to your environment, purple teaming exercises can address individual scenarios based on chains like this that aren't just, how do we fix this vulnerability? They aren't just, how do we patch the server to make sure it doesn't get attacked again? This allows us to actually address individual parts of attack chains so that every single step for an attacker is that much harder. So the last part of a purple team exercise, what is the most important part of really any offensive exercise? It's the report, right? I've always said that if it's not in the report, it didn't happen. For pen testing, red team exercises, purple team exercises, the report is absolutely what matters the most. You can do everything in the world, find every vulnerability, find every issue, but if it's not in the report, it might as well have not happened. The report is how we communicate results in a way that are actionable. So what should you be expecting from a purple team report? The first thing is you should be able to see what was done. What commands were executed, what payloads were run, what was the red team actually doing. in a reproducible way. What was the initial result? If the red team was running port scans, did the blue team detect it? In our case, they didn't, and they couldn't do anything about it. So this should be recorded. Third thing, what needs to change? Maybe improvements were made, right? Maybe the blue team was able to block port scans after looking into their tooling a little bit, after assessing the appliances that they have attached to the network. They were able to write a detection. Maybe they were able to turn on alerts for port scanning. Fourth, what was the retest result? So did the changes matter? When we reran the port scan, did it actually get blocked? Was the result different from the first time? And then lastly, we want to know what the next actions are. So can the changes be improved? Maybe what the blue team was able to do during the actual exercise was sort of a temporary measure. Maybe there's a better solution out there that can be explored later. If so, this is worth noting. Or maybe that solution was good enough, but the solution was only implemented in a particular part of the environment, and it can just be applied to other places. That should also be recorded. We want to know if improvements can be just taken and applied elsewhere, obviously without breaking anything, with context considered. But if it's possible, then that's an exponential improvement. When I talk about this being a continuous process, visually speaking, this is what I mean. So purple teaming ideally is not just a once a year, get it done, and think about it later exercise. Purple teaming, in contrast to more isolated engagements, is about continuous improvement. We are always considering purple teaming. And what that might look like is always being ready to craft a purple team exercise. And again, these are not long engagements. They don't have to be long engagements, at least for individual tests. Perhaps a news headline comes out like the MoveIt vulnerabilities that recently came out. If MoveIt is being used in your environment, obviously the first thing you want to do is make sure that it hasn't negatively affected you. But if you can get ahead of it and understand how a MoveIt compromise might affect your environment and test for things surrounding that kind of compromise, you can potentially mitigate it if it actually happens. Another example I like to use there at the end is a ransomware playbook leak. So a few years ago, a prominent ransomware gang, I'm not sure if they're prominent anymore, but they were definitely prominent at the time. Some associate leaked their entire playbook. Everything that they do, all the tools that they use, down to the commands to run. It was actually lauded as one of the best pieces of documentation for penetration testers or hackers in general, because it was so comprehensive. And it was also one of the best opportunities ever for blue teams to say, this is exactly what ransomware gangs are doing. We should figure out how to do something about every bit of this. Great source for a purple team exercise. So now that we've talked about what purple team exercises actually are, we've talked about how they work at a high level, let's start talking about going beyond this a little bit. So how can we actually take purple team exercises and leverage them for something more than security improvement? They are great for security improvement. They should absolutely be used constantly for security improvement, and that should never change. But my feeling is that they can be beneficial in other ways as well. To get there, the first thing we have to do is talk about compliance and revenue. So the hard reality is that being compliant means making a lot more money. From my experience in compliance, but also vCISO, I saw big sales, partnerships, acquisitions, all kinds of things happen generally not because of, but supported by compliance checks around business controls, around IT security controls. This was something that other companies wanted to see. They didn't want to buy a product unless they knew that the company making the product had reached some kind of security baseline. And if they had, great. And if all the other due diligence went through, no problems, then millions of dollars were going to change hands. This was a great thing for the companies that I was working with. The problem is that past that, oftentimes penetration tests, red team exercises, don't have that kind of obvious one-to-one revenue gain attached to them. SOC 2 attestations, they're by far, in my experience, the most requested compliance artifact. And SOC 2 doesn't even deal entirely with security. There's a security section, but most of it is just business controls around HR and other kinds of things. ISO certifications are popular because they actually do focus on information security management. PCI DSS is required for an entire section of the payments industry. And if you're not compliant with it, if you do a certain amount of volume, then the payment brands will just shut you down. High Trust is the most popular new one for companies that are touching PHI, want to assure their clients that they're not doing anything irresponsible with that PHI. So compliance is here to stay. And even though there's a common mantra that compliance is not equal security, compliance does equal revenue. And that's something that I am often at odds with my fellow hacker friends about, that is kind of hard to admit, but it's true. The bottom line is that companies spend money in order to make money. This is great news for penetration tests, primarily because of those 4 frameworks that I mentioned, most of them arguably require penetration testing. PCI DSS does, High Trust does, ISO does. SOC 2 is a little bit open to interpretation, but all of them, at least in their business controls, request some kind of external security assessment that is usually fulfilled by a penetration test. So this is great news for penetration tests, but not really great news for anything else. We have these compliance efforts that are pretty much directly tied to gained revenue. And because penetration testing is attached to those, penetration testing is not going anywhere. But moving past penetration testing to something more comprehensive or complicated, like a red team exercises, or something continuous and potentially more costly, at least resource-wise, like purple teaming, is not backed by some kind of compliance effort. So what I'm wondering is if this can be flipped on its head. So luckily, like I said, because penetration testing, and when I looking at this diagram, when I say we are here, I don't mean Bishop Fox, I don't mean me necessarily. What I mean is sort of the security mindset in general. So compliance gets penetration testing past what I call the existing at all hill. So we know that because compliance is required, penetration tests are probably required. That's a good thing, but it doesn't get us all of the way there. My hope, and what I'm going to get at in these next few slides, is that with purple team exercises, red team exercises also, but especially purple team exercises, we can hopefully get past what I call mount incidental cost reduction, and my idealistic goal of getting up the cliffs of security is value. So instead of just going from security being seen as a necessary component just because of compliance, I think there's more that security can accomplish that can actually get us to a point where we're no longer looking at penetration tests or red team exercises or purple team exercises as spending that has to be done in order to accomplish a different goal. They can actually be exercises that are spent on in order to accomplish their own unique goals. So I'll get into an example so that some of this makes sense. So imagine that you're like a really big casino or hotel. In fact, you know what? Let's go a little bit bigger. Imagine that your boss owns a lot of casinos and hotels. Maybe it's not just one in particular. Maybe it's, I don't know, most of the Vegas Strip. The boss is concerned. Looking at this slide, I would be concerned if I was the boss. So how do you reassure the boss that this sort of thing can't take place where you are. It has already happened in one particular area. One company or two companies have already gotten hit by an unfortunate ransomware attack that has had perhaps partially correlated financial results. And in a hypothetical scenario, your boss is coming to you and saying, I want to make sure this can't happen to us. Through purple teaming, again, taking this as a scary news headline and understanding how it happened as soon as possible, and then building purple team exercises around it, this is something that you can get ahead of. So because the boss is very concerned, let's say that we can reassure the boss that we've actually already tested a bunch of ransomware TTPs. So we've tested some things like shadow volume deletion. We've tested, in very small situations, file encryption methods that are used by ransomware groups. The good news is that ransomware group tactics are not that complicated for the most part, and they're pretty well documented, like the Conti playbook that I mentioned recently. The whole playbook got leaked. So at the very least, it's all referenceable. Their malware might be good, but in a lot of cases, they're just doing a lot of the same things that penetration testers are doing. That was one of the biggest revelations from this playbook, is that they are Kerber roasting just like us. They're extracting, or they're targeting vulnerable Active Directory certificate services templates just like we are. They're password spraying just like we are. These are things that we can get ahead of if we know that we're doing them. We can also reassure the boss that you restricted password reset capability to specific individuals. So in the case of this particular casino, password resets were not that complicated. We've made them more complicated. In fact, we've gone a step further and we require verification steps to resetting passwords. Nice. This is a win, right? Because there's very likely an avoided financial loss attached to that work. This is something that executives love to see. So when we're talking about return on investment and incidental cost reduction and getting budget for things like purple team exercises and red team exercises, this is something that we want to be able to communicate. This is a story that is great to communicate up the chain. Because for blue teams looking for funding and support from leadership, while fighting to not be perceived as a cost center, this is one of the best ways to do it. So communicating this story is a little difficult, but we can do it if we recontextualize what we're doing in purple team exercises. If we take those things from our previous slide that should be in a report, how can we take those and actually turn those into a story that we can tell upward? I'm going to use a few example metrics here that I've actually seen in environments that I have helped clients in the past begin to track themselves. So the first one here is percentage of MITRE attack TPs that are detected and blocked. And now what I don't mean, I need to get ahead of this. What I don't mean is the 100% MITRE coverage marketing language that we've seen in the last couple of years. That is not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is using something like the MITRE attack framework, part of which you can see on this slide here, and understanding which ones apply to the environment that you're in, and testing them and tracking the results and understanding which ones you can detect on. Maybe there are gaps, ones that you were not able to detect on that you need to build detections for. This can be tracked just like an asset inventory or an attack surface map or a threat model. Some other ones, average intruder detection rates over time. Maybe over a period of a couple of years, you're able to show an increase in incidents that you were able to attribute to a credible attack attempt, right? Because you're building detections and alerting infrastructure that is improving over time. Maybe you're able to detect more and more attacks before they happen, or as they're beginning to happen, and then stop them. And then especially noting which ones were blocked or stopped by an improvement that came from a purple team exercise. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to directly tie and correlate value, perceived, not just perceived value, but tangible value from purple team exercises that were otherwise theoretical. Maybe a last one is the efficacy of detecting data exfiltration. How many ways can you detect data leaving a trusted zone? These are all great metrics to track constantly and move up the chain to gain buy-in. So anyone who has attended a talk either at B-Sides or some other event from me knows that I get to a point in my talks where I get daydreamy and idealistic. It's almost part of my brand. So here you go. This is the part where we do that. So the thing that actually spurred my idea about this talk, and not just purple teaming, because I've done purple teaming, I've helped build purple team practices. I've talked about how purple team works and how to do it before. An angle I hadn't added before was how purple teaming can actually not just exist, not just reduce incidental cost, but quite potentially be a marketing strategy, quite potentially be tied to revenue opportunities. So earlier this year, there was a VPN company that published the results of their most recent penetration test, or at least some pertinent results. And this was surprising to me at first. My first thought, my gut instinct was, why in the world would they do this? This is a horrible idea. And then I thought about it and I realized that I was actually wrong, because what I started to think is, even though I don't use this VPN company, I realized that I kind of wanted to. And that struck me. I was a little bit surprised by that. And so I did some introspection and I started thinking about why I suddenly wanted to use this company, even though they were publicizing their weaknesses. Because this is a company whose entire identity is defined by how well they handle the confidentiality of information they are trusted with transmitting. So why would they do this? Why would they put the flaws of their most recent pen test up on their website? It's because transparency about improvement actually builds trust. So when technical teams can communicate transparently with leadership, perhaps we'll start seeing leaders of companies actually valuing security as a market differentiator, which is something we can all benefit from. Maybe purple teaming is the key to that. If we can go from penetration tests being lists of issues to fix and red team exercises being reports on, or producing reports on systemic problems, to a continuous improvement model that is actually generating metrics that can be communicated to the entire company about how even small individual efforts, many of them over time, can actually drastically improve security posture. I think that eventually we could get to a point where this is something that companies can actually brag about. Because right now, that is what happens with compliance. Plenty of marketing exists around ISO certifications, PCI DSS certifications. There's no reason why other components of a security program cannot be that. Another part of my brand for doing talks is giving away free stuff. So we just talked about metrics for tracking TTP effectiveness, detection rates, alerting capability. How can you actually do that? The good news is that there are tools out there and they're open source and they're free. So Vector is one of them. You'll notice that this diagram here actually looks quite a lot like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That is entirely on purpose. So one of the things that Vector actually allows you to do is run tests based on individual TTPs. You'll notice that in here, the IDs are down there, just like on the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You can test something like port scanning and record the results over time. And you can continuously run exercises against this dashboard, these panels, right? And change the results over time. And luckily, the people behind Vector also know that communicating metrics is probably really important. So this is something that you can do easily with Vector. The tools exist. This is possible. I think it's just that a lot of people don't know where to start looking. Here's some other free stuff. So like I mentioned, the attack matrix is completely public. It's something that can be accessed by everybody. Vector is down there at the bottom for reporting. And I've also included the Atomic Red Team website, which is a public repository of as many atomic tests of TTPs as possible. It doesn't cover everything, but it's a great starting point, especially for Windows environments, where if you don't exactly know where to start and you don't maybe have the expertise of a red team, but you want to understand how you can test some of these yourself, Atomic Red Team is a great place to start. I will say, do not do this in a live environment. These are best done in a test environment. In fact, I would only do these in a test environment because you are actually simulating attacks. You don't want to accidentally impact a real environment and cause actual downtime and actual problems. That would be a disaster. So we're going to move to Q&A because I already have some questions coming in that I have in my chat here. So I'm going to address these real quick. We'll start with, okay, where can I find out more about the TTP IDs from the attack chain slide? So MITRE ATT&CK Framework, that first link there, if you go there and you click into any one of their TTPs listed, you can get all kinds of information. You can get information on what threat groups have used it, how they've used it. You can read about the actual technique at a technical level to understand it more. This is where you'd want to look. This is the authoritative source, effectively. Next, we have, are there special tools that I can use for purple teaming? Yes. So I like to do purple teaming with just a regular old command and control server. In fact, a lot of times when I'm running commands, because we're not doing an actual attack exercise. We're not, in a purple team exercise, I am not fully acting as a red team operator. So it can be as simple as SSHing into a machine, remoting into a machine, right? And pretending that I got access some other way, which is fine because that's not what we're testing. We're not testing if I can get access. We're testing if the blue team can detect me after I already have access. So doing something like running a port scanning command doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to require days and days of setup. It can be as simple as using remote desktop to get into the machine and running a port scan. If you Google around, you will likely find some specialized tools. They exist. I'm not going to issue an opinion either way on them, but research around, and if one of them fits for you, great. If it doesn't, then there's plenty of open source tooling out there also. Next question, how would you start getting buy-in while the funding isn't there to hire somebody to help with a full purple team exercise? Yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, funding is not easy to secure. I know that. But if I was going to start trying to get buy-in, I would actually start with just something as simple as thinking through a threat model. You can do this with a whiteboard, right? If you're in a position where you have a good idea of what the environment looks like, all the facets of the environment, you can, in about an hour to an hour and a half, build out a pretty good threat model to start from on a whiteboard or with some diagramming software. And by that point, you'll have a lot more on your hands than a lot of companies do, in my experience. And you can start there. Even just by saying, we've pen tested this part of our attack surface, but not this one, that's a problem. Or maybe we haven't pen tested anything. Maybe we've never done a red team over here with this business unit. We need to do that. It doesn't have to be mapped entirely to TTPs. You can start at a very high level. Moving down from that, if you have a test environment at your disposal, or even just a virtual machine, it doesn't have to be a whole network setup. It doesn't have to be a whole Active Directory forest, for example. It can be just a single virtual machine that maybe has your EDR on it, or is built off of a golden image that is deployed for users. If it's isolated and you feel confident that you can safely run things like the Atomic Red Team TTPs, the actual test cases on that machine, and look at the results, you can build a decent profile for a lot of them off of the results of that VM testing. That's where I would start. And then I would document it all in something like Vector because it's easy to set up. It can be deployed with Docker. It runs as a web app. And like I mentioned on a previous slide, it generates metrics automatically. So it does as much as it can for you to help you communicate that story we've been talking about, that story of actual improvement up the chain to leadership. Before I go, just so everybody knows, we've got a lot of great research and guides on the Bishop Fox website. Go check them out. Getting inside the minds and methods of modern adversaries, understanding security blueprints, how to get red team right. This is all extremely valuable. I highly recommend going and reading it. And last, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming to my talk. I look forward to hopefully doing Purple Team with maybe some of you in the future. And thank you. Have a great rest of your day.